Right, op-ed section. This is a fairly long piece that's been pulled out of the archives, and it connects an awful lot of dots and also ties in why we need help because of the interconnectedness of all these different agencies and programs and bloodline families and secret groups that nobody's heard of, or the majority haven't. So this is a nice exposure of them. And what has been now almost forgotten is the decade of the 70s, which brought in the non-compete and also the digital program for the finances. And it was also a time of immense political upheaval, dirty tricks and incessant rumours of right-wing military coup d'etat in leading Western democracies. And amongst the long list of resultant casualties of this decade of tension were Britain's Prime Ministers Harold Wilson and Ted Heath, Australia's Gough Whitlam, Sweden's Olof Palme, America's Jimmy Carter and France's Francois Mitterrand, and the more southern flanks of NATO's European axis, Portugal, Spain, Turkey and Greece, converted rumour into chilling fact via the steel blue glaze of gun barrels. Italy, the home of the pizza, the Pope and propaganda Jew, or the P2 Lodge as it's called, came in for its own brand of political fix-it courtesy of Uncle Sam's very own CIA. From Russia with Love 7, we'll give you more details on that. But those three letters are going to crop up regularly, because they're involved in everything. And as the decade of the 80s slowly slipped above the now less than pink eastern horizon, right-wing beneficiaries of a coordinated international destabilisation programme gave their heartfelt thanks, and amongst them were Britain's Iron Lady, as she was called, Margaret Thatcher, Madonna of the armaments industry, hello Mr. Pinochet, and America's less brittle and considerably less acute Ronald Reagan, who was the humble originator of the mega textbook swallowing SDI Star Wars program. Where's the benefit of that now? Does anyone ask that question? Billions went into that. Where's the evidence or the benefit from it for the people? And also thus a valued friend of the boys at Guns R Us International. And these 2 decades saw a proliferation of right-wing, quasi-official and secretive groups that coordinated intelligence, hello Five Eyes, propaganda and undertook covert black operations around the globe. Now, one of the most shadowy of all is the Pinay Cercle, P-A-I-N-Y, named after its founder Antoine Pinay, who was the Premier of France back in 1951, known more simply as Le Cercle, and we have covered them in previous shows, and it is recognised as a more clandestine sister organisation to the already very secretive Bilderberg Group, a behind-the-scenes invisible influence network. Now, both these groups share a familiar membership, which includes Kissinger, Brzezinski, and David Rockefeller. And each of these 3 luminaries of the international power network are, in addition to the foregoing, influential members of the Trilateral Commission and the Council for Foreign Relations, as well as being regular attendees at Britain's Chatham House, the Royal Institute of International Affairs, which is a shadowy twin to America's Council Foreign Relations Group. Now, Antoine Pinay was extremely influential in Europe and the United States, and is also linked to the Rothschilds, where he had forged links with President Nixon, Pine attended the Bilderberg inaugural meeting at Oosterbeek in Holland during May of 1954. And by 1969, Pine, together with Jean Voilet, a lawyer working for the French Intelligence Service, SDECE, and Archduke Otto van Habsburg, hello Anna von Reitz, heir to the Austrian throne, formed Le Cercle and secretly began recruiting men of influence as members. Ms. von Reitz represents this group, I might add. She'll come up again in this. The intention was to shift the political climate of Europe to the far right via a secretly financed campaign of propaganda and to establish a private intelligence service that would work unofficially, Five Eyes, with the existing security apparatus of the West. And the author Stephen Dorrell also believes there are a serpentine interconnections between Le Cercle and also the Gladio network, which is a stay-behind anti-communist military guerrilla force set up by NATO's Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers of Europe, called SHAPE, during the 50s, and that was largely composed of ex-Nazis. Connecting the dots now. The Cercle has a different flavour to Bilderberg, however, and the latter is an important link to the overt influence organisations cited above, and almost certainly focuses its efforts on the broader political issues, whilst being careful to keep well away from direct actions. But Le Cercle has a much more hands-on role. Now, interestingly, its members or membership is more heavily composed of serving or former members of various intelligence services, senior military officers, as well as politicians, bankers and VIPs with the right-wing connections. Now, this Le Cercle goes back a lot further than people think. The Cercle, spelled Cercle, was unknown until the 1500s. Internal documents of the rightist and Le Cercle-funded Institute for the Study of Conflict, which were actually leaked out to Time Out magazine in 1975, but subsequently those documents then went missing. A common theme, that. A bit like Hillary's emails. At the time, ISC was headed by CIA agent and Cercle chairman Brian Crozier, who was heavily involved in another covert action group known at the time as simply as the 61. Unknown to Crozier, Hans von Machtenberg, that was a pseudonym apparently, a senior intelligence official of Germany's intelligence service BND and a member of Crozier's the 61, had been exchanging full reports on Crozier's secret get-togethers with Hans Longemann, who was formerly a senior ranking officer of Germany's intelligence service, the BND, and latterly head of Bavarian state security. Now, in a fit of depression, Longemann blew the whistle on a number of alarming and sinister conspiracies to the left-wing German magazine called Kronkert at the time, and soon the story was picked up by Der Spiegel, who featured it, and one of Longemann's more sensational reports, dated 1979, stated specific aims within this framework are to effect a change of government in the United Kingdom, accomplished in West Germany, to defend freedom of trade and of movement and to oppose all forms of subversion, including terrorism. And in another secret memorandum dated November the 8th, 1979, and addressed personal for the State Minister only, Longerman notes that Crozier worked directly with the CIA for years. You know, we've had all this nonsense about Russian collusion, and yet no one mentions about the collusion in every other country's elections done by CIA. No one mentions it. He concludes, therefore, that they are fully aware of his activities, and goes on to observe that Crozier has extensive connections with members, or more accurately, with former members of the most important Western security and intelligence services. Now, further on, he advised that Crozier, together with Dickie Franks, director of Britain's SIS, and Nicholas Elliott, a senior department head in MI6, were recently invited to Chequers, which is the country home of the current Prime Minister, which was Thatcher at the time, for a, quote, working meeting, unquote. And Longerman continues, it must therefore be concluded that MI6 is fully aware of, if not indeed one of the main sponsors of, Crozier's diverse circle of friends in international politics. Of course they are. CIA has been working with the MI6, KGB, Mossad since the 1940s. All under the banner of OSS. Additional subjects covered in Longerman's papers include the involvement of the main intelligence and security agencies, both as information sources and as recipients for information in these institutions, as well as undercover financial transactions for political aims. That would be utilised by conducting international campaigns aiming to discredit hostile personalities or events. That was part of the slush funds that were in the trust, the 6,500 trusts. Many of them were political assassination slush fund trusts. And the creation of a private intelligence service specialising according to a selective point of view, and the establishment of officers under suitable cover, each run by a coordinator from a central office. And current plans were underway to cover London, Washington, Paris, Munich and Madrid, and the plans also called for provision of contributions by certain well-known journalists in Britain, America and other countries, and the organisation of public demonstrations in particular areas on themes to be decided and selected. So there is your evidence of them buying off the journalists back in the 70s, and that they organise public demonstrations in particular areas on themes to be decided and selected. This is where the paid actors demonstrating comes in. The Cercle and their chairman Crozier clearly had lined up a whole strategy of political actions that were not only about but approved by the Western intelligence community, in addition to leading political figures including Prime Minister Thatcher and also presidential candidate Reagan. And in his autobiography, Crozier regales us with the repeat visits to the White House to meet senior administration figures, and in 1980 he flew to California to meet Reagan and brief him on his network and to offer his services when he became president. Now, Crozier stayed in close touch during the election with William Casey, We all know where he came from. Yes, those same three letters again. Who was Reagan's campaign chief and later appointed DCI of the CIA. Now, after Reagan's election victory, he appointed Californian friend William A. Wilson to act as his liaison with the Cercle and the related 61 group. Now, the Cercle has intimate connections with a host of interlocking right-wing outfits, including WACL, the Heritage Foundation, hello, Anna von Reitz again, Western Goals, ISC, Freedom Association, Interdoc, Bilderbergers, Pro-Pagan Dar Jew, or the P2 Lodge, Opus Dei, yes, them, the ones they try to deny exists, yes, it does exist, as do the Protocols of Zion, the Moonies, and also the Jonathan Institute. And many of these are funded fully or in part by the CIA with our money. And members have included Nicholas Elliott, British SIS MI6 department head, the CIA's Director of Central Intelligence, which is a misnomer in and of itself, in my opinion, William Colby, Colonel Botter, Swiss Military Intelligence, Franz Joseph Strauss, German Defense Minister, head of CSU Party, and the Bavarian Premier, Alfredo Sanchez Bella, head of European Operations for Spain's Secret Service, and also closely connected to Opus Dei, Giulio Andreotti, former Italian Prime Minister, P2 member and mafia confidant. Oh dear, he's got quite a list. General Antonio de Spinola, head of the Portuguese Putschists. Silva Munoz, former Franco minister and senior Opus Dei member. Monsignor Brunello, Vatican prelate and BNG agent, and Stefano della Scea, who's a leading member of P2 and Italy's Secret Service SID, and this list is by no means complete. Another major aim of the Cercle was to influence West German elections to ensure that Franz Joseph Strauss, the ultra-right-wing leader of the Christian Social Union Party, became Chancellor of Germany. But in the event, Strauss was defeated due, it is believed, to effective countermeasures taken by Germany's security and intelligence apparatus, the BND and BFV, whose operational chiefs do not follow his political lines. However, despite this setback, other projects were more successful. During the Cercle's meeting held on the 28th and 29th of June in 1980, no surprise, was held in Zurich, Switzerland, Rothschilds. Discussions were focused around a series of appropriate measures to promote the electoral campaign of presidential candidate Reagan against Carter. Of course they would. Reagan was in the 61. Elliott reported that in his context, positive contact had been made also with George Bush as well. I presume that's senior. Can't imagine a think tank group including junior. You would require a thick tank group to include him, in my opinion. Journalist David Teacher, a keen investigator of Cercle activities, observed it is becoming more and more apparent that the treatment reserved for Harold Wilson at the hands of the intelligence services was only the UK end of an international phenomenon. And around 1975, a surprising number of governments were targeted by their own or others intelligence agencies because of their radical policies. This is essentially when 5 eyes, which became 9 eyes, which became several eyes, and then became no eyes, basically took over all the governments. And he goes on to list a number of known destabilization programs that the Cercle are known or believed to have been involved in. And this includes the UK, the concerted efforts by elements in British intelligence and security services, along with the CIA again and BOSS, to bring down Wilson, Thorpe and Heath. In America, the CIA Operation Chaos, the FBI's COINTEL program, and of course Watergate. In Australia, the loan scandal and other destabilisation of Gough Whitlam by the CIA again and SIS. Additional Cercle targets may have been Olof Palme, Sweden's Prime Minister, and in 1987 the leading Swedish newspaper Dagens Nyheter carried a sensational story that the 03 section of the Swedish Intelligence Service, SAPO, were heavily involved in Palme's assassination following their fury at his policy of détente towards the Soviet Union, and possibly fearful that he may discover the extent of their implication in arms sales to Iran. And that links in the CIA again. Other direct actions possibly include a coup d'etat in Belgium during 1973, which was planned by gendarmerie officers and extreme right-wing groups. By no means least were the allegations by France's leading daily Le Monde, which in 1978 revealed the activities of Cercle member and head of the intelligence service SDECE, Alexander de Maranches. What is kind of interesting, which is kind of overlooked now, is how journalists back then informed the public and how little we get now. There is no journalists anymore. They're just script writers and script readers. Le Monde claimed that de Maranches led a domestic campaign of terrorism and disinformation, and it is fairly apparent that these activities were designedly to keep François Mitterrand from office during the 1974 elections. However, with the exception of the Longchamp papers and the ISC memo published in Lobster 17, there are no other Cercle documents available to confirm these allegations. Despite a strong focus on European issues, the Cercle were not unaware of the significance of establishing PSYOPs, action centres in North America. And in 1975, the Washington Institute for the Study of Conflict was launched under the chairmanship of George Ball. Now, characteristically, Ball, one-time senior managing director of the enormous Wall Street International Investment Bank called Lehman Brothers. It all ties in. And also the Under Secretary of State, 1961 through 66, and was a member of the Trilateral Commission on the Steering Committee of the Bilderberg Group and a member of the Council for Foreign Relations also. And his association with the WISC mark him as a close friend of the Cercle. Other members of the WISC Committee, Washington Institute for Study of Conflict, or should it say creation of conflict, were Mr. Brzezinski himself again, and Kermit, not the frog, Roosevelt of the CIA. Now, 4 years later, in 1979, Maurice Tugwell, a former head of information policy, a black propaganda unit set up by British military intelligence in Northern Ireland, formed the Canadian Centre for Conflict Studies, called CCS, largely operates on contract work, cue the term mercenary, for the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the Canadian Department of National Defence, plus others. We have seen that one aim of the Cercle was to aid in the election of President Reagan. Presumably, they can also cite this aim as being accomplished, and their close connection to George Bush, Sr., CIA, may have extended to helping in his drive to election victory also. And Canada also veered sharply to the right during the 80s. We may never know the true extent to which the Cercle and its Black Ops fronts, the ISC, WISC and CCS and others, had in effecting a wholesale change in government in Europe, North America and elsewhere. And clearly the decade of the 80s witnessed a marked shift to the political right in the Western democratic arena, and it would be stretching credulity to suggest that this rapid swing in political ideology took place accidentally. It is also abundantly obvious that the Cercle's primary influence resided in its top-level connections to the shadowy intelligence apparatus of the West, and at the same time it possessed serious clout inside the sinews of transatlantic power that repose in the Council for Foreign Relations, the Royal Institute of International Affairs, the Trilateral Commission, and also the Bilderberg Group. The foregoing outline, slim as it is, serves not only to underscore the inherent and potential weaknesses that reside in the institution of representative democracy, but it also demonstrates the will-o'-the-wisp nature of covert activities that hide comfortably behind the public face of government. That a small handful of influential men across the planet may be able to manipulate free elections to suit their personal and ideological advantage is not a new concept. Now, generally, utterances of this sort are met by the blanket rejection of conspiracy theory, which was created by Langley as well, and is ultimately discarded out of hand. But such rebuffs rarely take into account the underlying evidence, fragmentary as it is, but perhaps they're not meant to. Now, despite the wholesale collapse of the Soviet bloc, the Cercle has not packed up its victorious bags, nor have its members disbanded. Attendees in the 1990 Cercle meeting at the sumptuous Al Bustan Hotel, which is Muscat in Oman, included Jonathan Aitken, Minister of Defence Procurement, Alan Clark, Minister of State for Defence, Lord Julian Amery, Joint Chairman, Sheikh Qaboos, ruler of Oman, General Norman Schwarzkopf, the bear-like commander of the Allied forces in the Gulf, Paul Channon, former Secretary of State at the Department of Trade and Industry, and the head of Dutch Secret Service, an unnamed French naval admiral, plus other serving or former intelligence operatives and VIPs. Now, Aitken, Clark and Channon have all been heavily implicated in the arms to our Iraq affair examined by Lord Justice Richard Scott, and significantly Alan Clark revealed in his hugely successful diaries that the Cercle was funded by the CIA. Told you their name would crop up everywhere. With its apparent raison d'etre, anti-communist psyops clearly in tatters, one can only suppose that there is, or perhaps always was, an additional hidden agenda lurking behind Cercle activities. To understand what this may be, one must look further ahead. An increasing international focus on the calls for minimalist government. Again, that's something that the People's Club's pushing for. And this has always been a central plank of laissez-faire economics. Deregulation and the freeing of government-imposed constraints on international business to engage in activities as it sees fit is a long-term and obvious objective. And if history is any judge, the attainment of this singular goal may usher in a new dark age of unrestrained capitalism, which it did, coordinated by the gargantuan transnational corporations, which they did, all of whom are heavily represented on the membership rolls of the Council of Foreign Relations, the Trilaterals, RIIA, and the Bilderbergs. And this is why, like I said, we have to build our network, the People's Club. By sheer numbers alone, it can and will carry the power back to the people. We can't just all sit back and allow these think tank groups to run our lives. It hasn't worked for any of us. It's not working for them, never mind us. And by building that network, it will also take back our planet from these pre-selected psychopaths.